Jeff Merkley and Kash Patel weren't just clashing in a Senate hearing. What unfolded between them was the kind of moment that forces the entire country to stop and ask, who is actually protecting the Constitution? The tension didn't start with raised voices or dramatic accusations. It started with something far more unsettling. The head of America's top law enforcement agency struggling to clearly affirm one of the simplest, most fundamental rights in the Bill of Rights. And within seconds, the room shifted from routine oversight to a confrontation that revealed just how fragile constitutional understanding can be at the highest levels of government.
Senator Merkley.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much, Director Patel. And so, as I understood it, you testified yesterday that you'd like to have another $1 billion added on to the FY25 level to do the additional work you'd like to do on drug interdiction, fentanyl in general, and anti-terrorism. And today you gave us a budget that requests cutting $500 million. Which is it? Do you want us to, what are you asking of this committee? To add funds, add $1 billion, or to cut $500 million?
Thank you, Senator. Appreciate the opportunity. What I'm asking for is that with more, I can simply do more. And I was giving examples of what more I could do. I can do the mission, and I am in support of the budget here, and I'm working with appropriators and you to fill the gaps.
So you support the budget presented that cuts $500 million, but you also support us adding $1 billion should we choose to do that?
Well, I can't not support the budget as proposed, because then I would be supporting no budget.
Okay. Well, we've got those two options. We do look forward to further details from you about how you plan to modify the function of FBI on these different missions that you've highlighted today, so that we can give it the appropriate consideration. Mm-hmm. Director Patel, you're familiar with the Fifth Amendment.
Yes, Senator.
And it is really the freedom clause of the United States. It was 4 years into being a nation when Congress and the states said, hey, we have to make sure that there's not an over-aggressive government in the future that deprives us of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And you're familiar that that applies to all persons in the United States.
Yes, Senator.
So there's been a lot of concern about the several hundred immigrants who were swept off the streets of America and sent to El Salvador without due process. And does that concern you?
Senator, I'm not in a position to comment on whether or not they were given or not given due process or are supposed to be afforded due process. All the FBI did and all the FBI will continue to do is arrest those that have violated the law.
Okay, but to arrest, you have to investigate. Have you launched an investigation of this violation of the Freedom Clause of the U.S. Constitution?
Senator, I don't know that I agree with your characterization.
Well, that was my first question, whether or not you agree with the Fifth Amendment and are prepared to defend it. It is your job to investigate crimes.
Yes, I agree with the Fifth Amendment. I agree with the entire Constitution, and the men and women at the FBI decide.
So are you going to launch an investigation of the reported violation of the due process of several hundred individuals?
Again, Senator, it's not for me to call the balls and strikes on it. The men and women at the FBI who are trained to open investigations will make those calls.
So you have no influence over whether an investigation is opened?
I have influence over it, but you're asking me a constitutional question. I'm not a constitutional scholar.
Well, it's actually not it's a question also of law.
But your position is that every one of those individuals is by constitutional right afforded due process. I don't know the answer to that. I'm telling you.
You haven't read the Constitution?
It
says all persons.
I've got it right here, but what you're saying is that every single one of the illegals that was sent down to El Salvador is supposed to be given due process pursuant.
Yeah, that's what the Constitution says. It says no person.
It doesn't say that.
It does say no person. Yeah, I'll encourage you to read it, because it's also been affirmed by the Supreme Court repeatedly. In the case of Miranda versus Arizona, held the right of all individuals, regardless of citizenship status, the Supreme Court in Reno versus Flores. I mean, but it's the plain language of the Constitution. It concerns me that you're not familiar with the core concept of due process applying to all persons as written in black and white in the Constitution.
As the first public defender who's ever served at the FBI as its director, I am more aware of due process than any predecessor in my seat. You are delineating between removal proceedings and criminal acts. My job is to investigate criminal acts. That's what we do.
You are aware that the Fifth Amendment refers to taking away liberty, and when people are arrested on the street, detained and sent out of the country, that their liberty has been taken away.
Senator, that is a constitutional question that you are asking me to answer. It's not for me to answer.
The question has already been answered by the Supreme Court that they're protected. Therefore, it's a violation of law, and it's your responsibility to open an investigation. And you're saying today you will not do so?
I am not the agency involved in removal proceedings. That is a different branch of government.
So if an agency other than the FBI violates the law and the Constitution, you will not investigate because it's a different agency?
I will investigate every violation of law.
Well, you have, but you just said you're not investigating.
No. You and I are in disagreement on what is a violation of law. I have yet to hear from the Supreme Court your position as you have adjudicated it.
Well, very, very interesting, because the Supreme Court's been very clear, and I had heard you were trained in the law, so I expected maybe you would try to uphold it. You also took an oath to the Constitution.
Thank you for the reminder.
Well, it's important to remind you, since you're apparently unfamiliar with the very basics of the core protection of freedom in our Constitution.
What I am familiar with is protecting the American public, and that's what
Let me close with one question, Mr. Chairman. Will you make sure that due process in every action of the FBI is completely honored under your time as director?
Will I ensure that due process is followed?
Yes.
Under the Constitution?
Completely. Send that message throughout the FBI that due process must be followed, is constitutionally required. Make sure that it's done under your direction.
Sure.
Great. Thank you.
The moment Merkley asked Patel whether he understood due process, you could almost feel the air tighten. Most officials would have answered with confidence, maybe even pride, because due process isn't some obscure legal trivia. It's the backbone of American liberty. But instead of a firm, unequivocal statement, Patel stumbled into a vague explanation, followed by the line that set everything off. "I'm not a constitutional scholar." That answer didn't diffuse the moment. It ignited it. Because if the FBI director doesn't have clarity on the principle that protects every person's freedom, then what does that mean for the people whose lives he has the power to affect? Before the hearing veered into constitutional crisis territory, it started with something more mundane: the budget. Merkley asked a straightforward question about Patel's contradictory funding positions. One day, he wanted a $1 billion increase. The next, his official budget request showed a $500 million cut. Merkley pressed him, trying to figure out what the FBI was actually asking for. Patel's answer, supporting both the cut and the increase, wasn't just confusing. It signaled something deeper, a willingness to defend whatever numbers were placed in front of him, even if they contradicted each other. But the budget confusion was only the setup. What Merkley really wanted to probe wasn't money, it was principles. And when he transitioned from funding to the Fifth Amendment, the tone changed instantly. The polite back and forth dissolved. Something colder took over. Merkley asked Patel directly if he was familiar with the Fifth Amendment. It wasn't a trick, and it wasn't rhetorical. It was a test of whether the FBI director, entrusted with enormous power over citizens and non-citizens alike, understood the right that prevents the government from stripping people of their freedom without due process. Patel answered, yes, but what followed made that yes seem more like a reflex than a conviction. Merkley raised one of the biggest constitutional concerns of the year: reports that several hundred immigrants were swept off American streets and sent to another country without hearings, without representation, without due process. It's a claim that, if true, hits the heart of constitutional protections. The Fifth Amendment does not say citizen. It says person, and the framers chose that word deliberately. But when Merkley asked Patel whether these individuals were entitled to due process, Patel's response was a stunning, "I don't know the answer to that." It was the kind of answer that makes the room go silent, not because people are shocked, but because they're trying to process what they just heard. The director of the FBI, when asked whether all persons are protected from being deprived of liberty without due process, couldn't affirm the plain language written directly into the Constitution. Merkley, visibly stunned, held up the Constitution and reminded Patel that the Supreme Court has affirmed this principle multiple times across decades. He cited rulings. He quoted the text itself. And he asked again, how can the FBI director not know something this basic? Then came the line that would define the entire exchange. Have you even read the Constitution? It wasn't sarcasm. It wasn't political theater. It was raw frustration building from the realization that the official who leads federal law enforcement seemed unable or unwilling to acknowledge a fundamental constitutional protection. Patel tried to walk the line between legal responsibility and bureaucratic neutrality. He insisted that the FBI simply arrests people and that removal proceedings belong to a different agency. But that argument raised an even bigger concern. If one part of the government violates the Constitution, does the FBI see it as outside their responsibility? Patel's answers suggested yes. Merkley's questions demanded no, because when a government official, any official, tries to treat constitutional guarantees like optional guidelines or somebody else's problem, that's where abuse grows. That's where rights erode. That's how democracies drift. The hearing intensified when Merkley pointed out the obvious. If people are arrested, detained, and removed from the country, their liberty has been taken away. That triggers due process protections. It's not complicated. It's basic constitutional law. And yet Patel insisted that determining constitutional violations wasn't for him, that someone else handles that part. This wasn't a disagreement about political strategy. This was a disagreement about whether the Constitution still means what it says. Merkley asked whether the FBI director would investigate constitutional violations committed by another agency. Patel said he would investigate violations of law, but still refused to say whether what occurred was illegal. Merkley countered that the Supreme Court already settled the question. All persons have due process rights. Therefore, violating those rights is illegal. Therefore, the FBI must investigate. Patel's refusal to commit sparked one of the most tense standoffs in any Senate hearing this year. But Merkley wasn't finished. He asked Patel point-blank if he would ensure due process is honored in every action of the FBI under his leadership. Patel hesitated before finally answering. Sure. It wasn't a confident promise. It sounded more like a reluctant concession after realizing he had no choice but to say yes. That single word, sure, captured the entire problem. It shouldn't take pressure, confrontation, and public embarrassment for the FBI director to commit to respecting the Constitution. What makes this exchange matter is not the politics. It's the principle. Due process isn't partisan. It's universal. It protects everyone, regardless of party, background, immigration status, or ideology. It exists to stop government overreach before it starts. The reality is simple. If the government can deny rights to one group, it can deny rights to any group. If one person can be taken off the street without a hearing, then none of us are as protected as we believe that if those in power don't understand or don't prioritize the limits placed on their authority, then the Constitution becomes symbolic rather than functional. That Merkley's fury wasn't about scoring points. It was about defending the only barrier between government power and individual freedom. And Patel's uncertainty wasn't just a bad answer. It was a warning. This hearing was a rare window into a problem that usually stays hidden: the quiet erosion of constitutional literacy within the institutions designed to enforce the law. When leaders begin to treat core rights as negotiable or secondary or somebody else's responsibility, the entire system starts to tilt. And that's why people across the country reacted so strongly to this exchange. They saw something they weren't supposed to see, a moment where power showed its ignorance, and an elected official refused to let it slide. The Constitution isn't a prop. It isn't a pocket accessory to hold up in a hearing. It's a binding promise. A promise that lawmakers swear to defend. A promise that federal officers swear to uphold. A promise written to protect the powerless from the powerful. Merkley wasn't trying to embarrass Patel. He was trying to remind him of the oath he took. The most striking part of the interaction wasn't the frustration in Merkley's voice. It was the confusion in Patel's, the hesitation, the uncertainty, the unwillingness to firmly stand behind something as basic as due process. And that's what makes this hearing so important. Because the moment officials stop seeing the Constitution as a clear guide and start seeing it as a tool to interpret, bend, or sidestep, public trust collapses. And when trust collapses, democratic systems start to fracture. Whether you're conservative, progressive, or somewhere in between, due process protects you. It's the principle that ensures the government can't silence you, detain you, or punish you without proving its case. It's the principle that stops power from turning into control. Merkley defended that principle fiercely. Patel struggled to articulate it. And that contrast revealed more about the state of American governance than any policy debate could. What happens next depends on how deeply people understand what they saw. Because if the public shrugs off moments like this, the slow erosion of rights continues unchecked. But if people pay attention, really pay attention, then hearings like this become turning points that, if you believe that the Constitution still matters, if you believe that no person should lose their liberty without due process, if you believe that government power must always be accountable to the people, stay engaged, subscribe, like the video, and turn on notifications so you never miss these breakdowns. Because understanding what happens in these hearings isn't just political content, it's defending the core idea of America. And the more people who understand that, the stronger our democracy becomes.